What happens when a 6-year-old girl, wearing a worn red sweater and carrying nothing but a handmade resume, walks into the office of a powerful CEO and says, "I need a job"? What kind of pain pushes a child to skip school and confront the world's wealthiest, not for herself, but to try and save her dying mother? And what does it do to a man who's built his life behind glass walls and cold decisions, when he's suddenly faced with a kind of bravery that no adult ever showed him? This isn't a story about charity. It's about the moment love, desperation, and courage walked into a boardroom and rewrote a man's definition of success forever. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us what truly matters. Now, let's begin. Richard Donovan was no stranger to surprises in the business world, but that morning, he froze when a little girl, about 6 years old, wearing a red sweater, walked into his glass-walled office, placed a handwritten note on his desk, and said, "I need a job." Richard's day had started like any other, early, precise, and scheduled to the minute. His luxury sedan glided through the underground gate of the steel and glass building named Arclight Tower, which he owned, by exactly 8 URC. He was already seated in his top-floor office, focused on reviewing the quarterly financial reports. His suit was immaculately pressed, his tie as perfect as ever, and his espresso untouched as he scanned emails with the practiced eyes of a man so accustomed to power he no longer paid it any mind. His schedule was packed with meetings, calls, and presentations, and he had no intention of deviating from it. Until his secretary. Laura, pale-faced and slightly panicked, knocked and pushed the door open without waiting for his permission. "Sir, someone wants to see you," she said, holding a small piece of paper, her voice unsure, caught between laughter and calling security. "It's a little girl." Richard looked up, frowning. "A child," he repeated flatly, assuming there must be some mistake. But before he could ask more, the office door swung wide open, and someone he never imagined would enter his life stepped inside. The little girl couldn't have been older than 6. Light brown hair, slightly messy. Big, calm brown eyes. She wore a red sweater, a denim skirt, and worn sneakers. A shabby backpack hung over her shoulder. In her hand, she held a piece of paper. Without hesitation, she walked up to the desk, stood on tiptoe, placed the paper on its surface, and looked up, speaking clearly as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "I need a job." Richard didn't react immediately. He didn't know what to do. The room fell silent, with only the distant hum of the city behind the massive glass panes. He slowly picked up the paper. It was a resume written by a child. The large, clumsy handwriting read, "I can clean. Quiet. I don't cry in front of people. I can help. I will learn." In each corner of the page were little stars, and, next to the last line, a small, trembling heart beside the word, "Please." Richard set the paper down, leaned forward to meet her gaze, and spoke softly. "Why are you here, sweetheart? You're just a kid. You don't need a job." The girl looked him straight in the eyes, unblinking, and answered with a calmness far beyond her years. "My mom is dying. No tears, no dramatics, just the truth." The entire room seemed to stop. Richard, a man who had built an empire, shut down countless rival companies without hesitation, suddenly felt a lump in his throat. She said it like she had said it hundreds of times. No crying, no begging, just acceptance and an unshakable belief. Her tiny hands clenched at her sides, her voice steady. "I have to help my mom. We don't have any money left. If I get a job, maybe she can live." Richard Donovan, a man who believed he'd seen everything, suddenly found himself unable to breathe. not because he didn't know what to say, but because, for the first time in years, someone had stepped into his perfect world and reminded him what helplessness felt like. But this girl, she wasn't helpless. She had come on her own. She had a goal, and she chose to knock on the top floor. Richard stood up, still holding the piece of paper, and asked, "What's your name?" She answered without hesitation, "Lily Thompson." That was the moment his life began to change direction. He didn't know it yet, but from that second on, everything his company, his life philosophy, his definition of success would never be the same again. Richard stood silent in his office. The child scribbled our sum in his hand, his mind racing with questions. Lily stood still, her eyes resolute, her small figure steady. Not a trace of fear, not a flicker of doubt. In all his years, he had listened to powerful people pitch million-dollar ideas, but no one had ever entered that room with such determination and silenced him, the way a 6-year-old girl just had. He had heard hundreds of million-dollar ideas from industry leaders, but no one had ever made the room fall as silent as Lily Thompson just had. Richard Donovan slowly sat back into his high-end leather swivel chair and gestured for the little girl to take the seat across from him. Lily climbed onto the chair far too big for her small frame with some effort. Her feet didn't touch the ground, and her hands rested neatly on her lap. Richard cleared his throat, leaning forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "Lily, do you know where you are?" She nodded without hesitation. "I do. You're Mr. Donovan. My mom said people with money are the ones who can help when no one else can." Her answer was clear, without a trace of fear. It left Richard momentarily speechless. He cast a quick glance toward Laura, his secretary, who was still frozen in place by the door. He signaled for her to leave, then gently shut the door. The room fell into a deeper silence than even soundproof glass could provide. Only the faint noise of traffic drifted in from Valemont Avenue far below. Richard leaned in closer, his voice now much softer. "Can you tell me what happened to your mom?" Lily nodded again. "My mom is sick. She doesn't tell me everything, but I know something inside her isn't right. She used to be really strong. Now she can't go to work anymore. The hospital says it costs a lot." Her voice was clear, each word spoken as if rehearsed 100 times. "We don't live at our house anymore. Now we sleep in a small room we're renting. Sometimes I eat cereal for dinner." A sudden wave of emotion caught in Richard's chest. He had grown up poor too, but he'd never had to ask for a job at 6 years old, never had to knock on a CEO's door just to try and save a life. "Does your mom know you came here?" he asked gently. Lily shook her head. "If she knew, she wouldn't let me. But I found your name in the newspaper. I remembered this building because it's big and shiny. People say you're the man who fixes everything really fast. So I thought maybe you can fix this too." Richard took a deep breath. He stood up and walked to the glass wall, looking down at the city. Below him, the roads wove together, lights blinked, and thousands of people moved through the world, quietly carrying pain no one else could see. He turned back around. The girl was gently swinging her legs, her eyes focused on the bookshelf behind his desk. "You're very brave, Lily," he said. "A lot of adults wouldn't have the courage to do what you just did." She simply shrugged. "It's not about being brave. It's just when you love someone, you do anything." The simple sentence struck straight into the deepest part of his mind. Memories came flooding back of all the times he had turned his back on loved ones in pursuit of ambition, power, and control. And now, here was a child standing in the wreckage of her own world, choosing love over fear. Richard knelt down, looking her directly in the eyes. "All right," he said, voice low but steady. "We're going to see your mom." Lily's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" He nodded. "I can't promise anything just yet, but I want to meet her. And if I can help, I will." Lily hopped down from the chair, tightening the strap of her backpack on her shoulder. "My mom's at Grayfield Medical Center, room 12. She sleeps a lot, but I think she'll like you for the first time all day." Richard smiled. "Then let's go." Not a meeting, not a power lunch. Just a man stepping out of his office with a 6-year-old girl, the one who had made him break the most sacred rule he lived by. Some things can't wait. The company car pulled away from Arclight Tower, rolling through the late afternoon avenues. The distance wasn't far, but the journey felt longer than any meeting Richard had ever attended, not because of traffic, but because of the weight of the thoughts filling his mind. His entire life had been ruled by decisions made on profit margins and charts, but this time he wasn't following strategy. He was following something deeper. A hollow space in his heart he hadn't felt in years. Lily sat in the back seat, legs swinging above the floor, her backpack clutched close to her chest. She didn't say much, only answering when asked for directions. The rest of the time, she stared out the window, her gaze focused, making Richard feel both heartbroken and quietly in awe. Lily Thompson didn't say much during the ride. She only answered when asked for directions the rest of the time. She quietly stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the building slowly fading behind them. That calm focus moved Richard Donovan deeply and made him admire her. A 6-year-old child carrying within her a quiet strength most adults couldn't begin to fathom. When the car pulled up in front of a small, unremarkable building, gray walls, a faded sign, tiny windows barely letting in light, Richard realized he was standing in front of the place this little girl considered her whole world, Grayfield Medical Center. Lily opened the car door, jumped out quickly, and waited by it, not entering until Richard came to her side. Together. They walked through the old glass doors of the waiting lobby. The nurse at the reception desk looked up, surprised to see a sharply dressed man in an expensive coat and polished leather shoes. But it was Lily who spoke first. "Room 12, please," she said firmly. "My mom's there." The nurse hesitated briefly, then nodded and pointed down the hallway to the left. Richard followed Lily past worn floor tiles and peeling paint on the walls. Each step felt heavier, as if he were slowly entering another world he had never faced before, harsh, weathered, and heartbreakingly quiet. At the door marked with a faded sign that read 12, Lily stopped. Her small hand rested on the doorknob, and she whispered, "My mom gets tired a lot. Sometimes when I talk, she doesn't even open her eyes." Richard gave a small nod, his expression softening. Lily opened the door. The room was dimly lit, the overhead light faint. On the hospital bed lay a thin woman, her face pale and fragilely so delicate, it seemed a breeze could carry her away. IV tubes extended from her arms to beeping monitors, keeping rhythm with what remained of her life. Lily walked straight to the bed, took off her backpack and placed it on a chair, then gently held her mother's hand. "Mom, I brought someone," she whispered. "It's the man I told you about." Richard stood at the foot of the bed, unsure of what to say, not knowing where to begin. The woman Rachel Thompson had clearly endured more than any ordinary person should be expected to. Even in sleep, she radiated a strange kind of strength, not the kind that showed on the outside, but something deeper of fragile, persistent will to live. Richard stepped forward and quietly set the small sum Lily had once given him on the table beside the bed. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said softly, "but today I met your daughter, and I think I may never be the same again." Lily sat down in the chair next to the bed, looking at him with the seriousness of an adult. My mom used to be a nurse. She worked hard, helped a lot of people. But when she got sick, no one helped her. That's why I came to you. Richard knelt beside the bed, one hand resting on its edge. You did the right thing, he replied, voice low, but full of conviction. From now on, I'll help your mom. A few moments later, a nurse came in to check the vital signs. She looked from Rachel to Lily, then to Richard, the stranger in the suit, and seemed to understand that this wasn't a routine visit. She said quietly, "She's held on for a few days, but we don't have the resources to continue advanced treatment." Richard nodded, absorbing every word. After the nurse left, he pulled out his phone. The first call was to his personal physician doctor, Michael Yates, requesting a full assessment of Rachel's medical condition and immediate arrangements for transfer to a better facility. The second call was to his legal team, instructing them to establish a dedicated fund to cover any and all treatment Rachel Thompson might need. No cost limits, no paperwork barriers. When he returned to the room, Lily was resting her head on her mother's hand. She was tired, but forced her eyes open when she saw him come back. "Are you really going to help my mom?" she asked in a tiny voice. Richard sat down, gently taking her hand. "I promise, Lily. I'll do everything I can." He couldn't quite explain everything that had happened that day. A little girl with a backpack and a piece of paper had shattered the ice inside him as he thought had frozen solid forever. But now, everything was beginning again, not with a promise, but with action. In the quiet hospital room, surrounded by softly beeping machines and dim lighting, Richard Donovan sat in silence beside a woman he had never met and a little girl who had placed all her trust in him with everything she had. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't just a passing event. This was a beginning. Something was about to change him forever. The next morning, Richard returned to Grayfield Medical Center just as the sun began to rise. He had barely slept all night. His mind kept circling back to the image of Rachel Thompson lying still in her hospital bed, and Lily Small, yet fearless, sitting by her mother's side like a steadfast warrior. What haunted him wasn't pity, it was responsibility. Not the kind tied to shareholders or financial reports, but a human responsibility, the kind that brings you to someone's side before they even call your name. As he stepped into the lobby, the nurses at the reception desk looked surprised, but then nodded respectfully. Richard had already made all the arrangements today. Rachel would be transferred to a private hospital funded by the charity foundation run by his corporation. The night before, medical specialists had reviewed her case file and devised a treatment plan, an aggressive but hopeful course of action. Everything moved quickly because Richard wouldn't let red tape cost her any more time. He'd witnessed too many lives lost to procedural delays, but this time was different. This time, it was personal. This time, the urgency came from his heart. He walked down the now familiar corridor, carrying a small paper bag in his hand, breakfast, some fruit, a muffin, and a cup of hot cocoa. Lily was awake, curled up in the chair beside the hospital bed, her legs tucked close to her chest, eyes still sleepy. But when she saw Richard, she gave a small smile, a smile just big enough to calm the tightness in his chest. He handed her the food. She accepted it and gave a quiet nod of thanks. Rachel was still asleep, her breathing steady but faint, the machines blinking softly in rhythm with her fragile life signs. Richard sat beside the bed and gently explained the transfer plan to Lily. About the new place cleaner, more modern, where her mother would receive proper care. Lily didn't ask many questions. She simply listened, clutching the cup of cocoa like it held something sacred. "Will she wake up there?" she asked quietly, eyes cast downward. Richard didn't offer empty promises. "Her chances will be better," he said, "and well, be right there with her every day." The hospital transfer happened just before noon. A private ambulance arrived. Richard insisted on riding along. Inside, Lily sat beside her mother, holding her hand tightly, not letting go for a single second. Richard took the opportunity to make more calls. He arranged for a temporary room for Lily near the hospital's pediatric wing and confirmed that the medical team was prepared to receive Rachel the moment she arrived. When they reached St. Alden Medical Pavilion, a full team was waiting. Rachel's new room was bright and spacious, with large windows letting in the early sunlight. Lily quickly opened her backpack and pulled out a drawing. She placed it on the table beside the bed. In it were three figures, a woman with long hair, a smiling little girl, and a man in a suit, broad-shouldered and bright-faced. Underneath, she had scrawled one word, Richard. That evening, after the nurses finished checking vitals and adjusting equipment, Richard sat with Lily in the family lounge. She had been changed into a clean sweater, her hair brushed and neatly tied. She looked smaller no longer, bracing herself as she had on the first day. She looked like a child again. "Do you think my mom will smile again?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Richard looked at her. "Sincere. I believe she will, and I think that first smile will be because of you." Lily didn't answer. She simply leaned over and rested her head on his arm. He stayed still, saying nothing, letting her rest in that rare, peaceful moment. There was no longer anything unfamiliar, nothing left to question. Richard Donovan understood this wasn't a passing act of kindness. This was a commitment, the beginning of something real and unforgettable. By now, Richard Donovan no longer found his presence at the hospital strange. He no longer questioned why he was here, why this mattered so much. From the moment Lily walked into his office until now, everything had changed. He no longer saw this as a short-term act of charity. He had truly stepped into their lives not just to save Rachel, but to give Lily back a piece of the childhood that had been taken from her too soon. As night fell, a nurse escorted Lily to the small room Richard had arranged near the pediatric ward. He remained seated in the hallway, just outside Rachel's room. No laptop, no reports, no phone calls, no spreadsheets, just him and the quiet, steady hum of the monitors. Through the glass, he watched Rachel's chest rise and fall gently, and he whispered, not to anyone else, but to himself, "We're not done yet. This is just the beginning." Day 5 came, marked by a quiet but clear shift. Not some miraculous turnaround, but a feeling as if something long dormant had begun to stir. Richard arrived early at St. Alden Medical Pavilion before the first shift even began. He greeted the nurses by name, quickly skimmed the latest medical updates, and made his way straight to the ICU, where Rachel was being monitored around the clock. Lily was already there, curled up in a chair, softly humming a lullaby. When she saw Richard, she sat upright and gave him a warm smile. Rachel's condition had not worsened overnight, which the doctors took as a promising sign. Her oxygen levels were stable, blood pressure consistent, and the readings showed that her body was responding positively to the treatment. It couldn't yet be called recovery, but it was hope. Lily didn't ask much. She listened to every word the doctors said, then quietly repeated their explanations to herself, as if trying to commit every detail to memory. Richard spent the entire morning in meetings with specialists. He brought in a nutritionist to assess Rachel's needs once she could begin eating again. He consulted with a neurologist about potential complications, and he insisted that all departments update him directly on the progress daily. He had never involved himself so deeply in any project before. But this wasn't a project. This was a person, a mother, the entire world of a little girl. In the afternoon, he took Lily out to the hospital garden for some fresh air. One of the kind nurses had found her a small jacket. She ran ahead, pausing at every flower bed as if each bloom held a secret answer. Richard followed silently, watching. When they reached the stone bench near the fountain, Lily sat down and pulled a folded sheet of paper from her backpack. It was a drawing she had made the night before. In it were 3 people, a woman with long hair, a smiling little girl, and a tall man in a blue suit. Without a word, she handed it to him. He studied it for a long moment, then asked gently, "This man is that me?" Lily nodded. "You're part of my family now, even if you don't have to be." Richard carefully folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of his coat. "I want to be, not just today, forever." She didn't reply, only gently placed her hand into his. And that was enough. That night, Richard stayed in the hospital room. Lily had fallen asleep in the nearby family lounge. He sat beside Rachel, carefully observing every movement, the subtle furrow of her brow, the faint twitch of a hand. He remembered what Lily had once told him, that her mother used to sing lullabies when she couldn't sleep. So he began to speak, not to sing, but to tell stories. Stories from his own childhood, about his mother, who worked 2 jobs, about dozing off under a desk, about dreaming of having enough money to make things better. And then, looking at Rachel lying there, bathed in soft light and breathing delicately, he realized it wasn't money that had saved them. It was love, presence, and courage, the kind that a 6-year-old child should never have to carry, but had borne without complaint. Richard Donovan was still there, sitting silently beside the hospital bed where Rachel Thompson lay motionless. He told her stories he hadn't shared in years about the mother who once worked 2 jobs to pay for his schooling, about the nights he fell asleep under her office desk, and about the innocent childhood belief that someday, if he just had enough money, he could fix everything. But when he looked at Rachel, thought about Lily, he understood what had saved them wasn't money. It was love, presence, and the courage no child should have to carry, but still did, because she loved. As the machines dimmed their lights for the night and the room settled into stillness, Richard remained in his seat. He didn't leave. He couldn't, because he felt something in Rachel's breathing, fragile but real, as if somewhere between sleep and waking. She knew he was there, that she and her daughter were no longer alone. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to walk away. He belonged to this journey now, completely, and that changed everything. The 6th morning began with a silence unlike any other. Not a cold, sterile quiet, but the kind that waits. Richard arrived at St. Alden Medical Pavilion just after dawn, holding 2 cups of hot cocoa and a paper bag filled with fresh pastries. He had stopped by the corner bakery, a place he had passed by every day for years, but never entered until this week. Now, he knew the name of the woman behind the counter. He knew which pastry Lily liked best. Details that once seemed trivial now meant everything. He entered the pediatric lounge. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the sofa, a comic book in her lap, but her eyes gazing out the window, watching the shifting light. When she saw him, she turned and smiled, a tired but genuine smile that made his heart tighten. He handed her the cocoa and sat beside her without a word. They sat like that, in the gentle morning, sipping in silence, as if they'd done it 100 times before. Today was different. The doctors had prepared him for the possibility that Rachel might wake up. Her vitals continued to stabilize. The neurologist report showed promising brain activity. No one dared make promises, but hope was no longer a whisper-thin word. It stood steady, clear. Richard had arranged to work from the hospital the entire day. His team understood. Meetings were rescheduled, calls were rerouted. He brought his laptop, but the truth was, spreadsheets no longer held his attention. Every time his thoughts drifted, his eyes returned to the hallway leading to her room. Around midday, Richard and Lily went to visit Rachel. The nurses had placed fresh flowers by the window, adjusted the machines to soften the atmosphere, making the space feel less clinical, more human. Lily walked up to the bed, as she always did, and took her mother's hand. But this time, something different happened. Rachel's hand gently moved, then her eyelids fluttered. Richard froze. His breath caught. Every cell in his body seemed to brace for a miracle. Slowly, with great effort, Rachel opened her eyes. Her gaze was unfocused at first, lips too dry to form words. But then she blinked again, her head tilting slightly to one side. Her eyes landed on the image of Lily, tears quietly rolling down her cheeks. A tiny hand clutched her mother's. "Mom," Lily whispered like a breeze. "I'm here. I'm right here." Rachel blinked again, and then, with a voice so faint it broke the heart, she murmured, "Lily." Just one word. But it was like sunlight flooding the room. Richard had never heard anything so delicate, yet so powerful. A nurse rushed in, followed closely by a doctor. Within moments, the room became a center of urgent activity. The beep of monitors, rapid questions, clinical commands. But Richard didn't hear any of it. He was just watching Rachel, because she was truly back. Amid the hurried footsteps of nurses and the steady beeping of machines, Richard Donovan hardly noticed anything else. He stood quietly at the edge of the room, heart pounding, eyes fixed on Rachel Thompson. When the doctors completed their assessments and the machines settled into their usual rhythm, Rachel turned to look at him for the first time. Her eyes were tired, clouded by exhaustion, but there was something unmistakably clear in her gaze, not from memory, but from presence. She knew he had been there. She knew, even without being told, that her daughter had not been alone. She tried to speak, but her throat tightened. Richard stepped closer and gently took her other hand. "No rush," he whispered. "We're not going anywhere." Lily climbed onto the bed, laying her head near her mother's shoulder, careful not to disturb the maze of wires. Rachel raised a trembling hand to gently touch her daughter's, hair fingers quivering but soft, as if to confirm this wasn't a dream. That evening, after things had quieted down, Richard and Lily sat in the hospital garden. The air was cool. The sky shifted softly from pink to purple, then to a deep golden hue. Lily sat close to him, wrapped in the jacket he had bought her earlier that week. "She said my name," she whispered. "That means she's still mine." "Right." Richard nodded. "She never left. Sweetheart." She was just finding her way back. Lily looked up at him. "You helped Mom. You helped me, too." Richard didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars had begun to appear, and felt something quietly shift inside him. A 6-year-old child had changed the course of his life more than anything else had in decades. Not by begging, not by asking for his wealth, but by showing up, by believing, and by bearing a kind of courage no child should ever have to carry, but she had, because no one else could. As the first stars twinkled overhead, Richard made a silent promise. Whatever came next, he wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. This was no longer just a gesture of kindness. This was his new life. And for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The morning of the 7th day felt lighter, not because the hardships were over, but because something new was beginning to bloom a beginning. Rachel was able to speak again, her voice still hoarse and thin, but now with emotion and awareness. She asked for a glass of water, then asked about Lily, and finally, in a faint murmur, said, "The man beside me." "Who is he?" Lily grinned brightly. "That's Richard. He's helping us." Rachel turned her eyes to him, tired but clear. This time, he introduced himself not as a businessman, but simply as someone trying to do the right thing. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic. Rachel's health was still fragile, but her body was responding well to treatment. The risk of permanent coma had now receded. Lily rarely left her mother's side, except when Richard gently encouraged her to eat or rest. She had begun to believe that being by her mother's side was safe again. And Richard was no longer a visitor. He was part of this place. Nurses called him by name. Doctors shared updates with him. He was treated like family. That afternoon, a social worker named Mara came by to continue the support process. She had met Richard previously when he arranged the hospital transfer, but today she returned to discuss the next steps. They met in the family lounge across from the ICU. Lily sat quietly in a beanbag chair nearby, focused on her drawing, this time a picture of her mother with a flower crown. Mara flipped through the file prepared by Richard's legal team. She nodded, her expression tinged with surprise. "You've gone above and beyond," she said, turning each page. "Usually, someone in your position donates and steps back. But you stayed. You chose to be here." Richard leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Because this isn't charity," he said. "This is family, even if it doesn't look like it from the outside." Maris questioned the social worker made Richard Donovan pause for a beat. She had asked whether he had ever considered becoming Lily's legal guardian, should circumstances require it. He didn't hesitate out of reluctance, but because he had never thought of it in formal terms. It hadn't happened on paper. It had happened piece by piece, in the moments he sat with her in waiting rooms, in the way he kept her drawings tucked in his coat pocket, in knowing she liked her muffins slightly burnt on the edges. "Yes," he finally replied, "if it comes to that, I will. I want to be by her side. Later." He and Lily returned to the hospital room. Rachel was awake, her frail hands gently feeling the blanket as if searching for something, for her daughter. Lily climbed onto the bed and held up her newest drawing. "You've got flowers now, Mom," she pointed out. "Because you're getting better," Rachel smiled weakly, but genuinely. Her eyes glistened with gratitude. She turned to Richard and softly said, "I know I never asked for help, but thank you for helping." Even when I didn't ask, Richard sat beside the bed. No longer a powerful man, no longer a savior, just a human being who needed this connection as much as they did. "It was your daughter who stepped into my life and reminded me what actually matters," he said. "I should be the one thanking you." That night, the three of them, an unconventional family, shared a meal together, hospital food reheated in a microwave, served in paper trays. But for Lily, it was a feast. She told silly stories that made her mother laugh, softly, despite the fatigue. And Richard just sat there, listening like every word was a gift. The night nurse, watching quietly from the doorway, later said, "It's been a long time since this room felt that warm." At bedtime, Richard helped Lily settle onto the fold-out cot beside her mother's bed. She looked up at him, eyes heavy with sleep. "Will things always be like this?" she asked softly. Richard didn't lie. "It won't always be easy," he said. "But it'll be here. We'll get through it together." Lily squeezed his hand. "Am glad I came to your office." Richard gently squeezed back. "So am I." You changed everything." That night, as the hospital fell into silence, Richard was no longer a stranger, no longer the man behind the glass office walls. He had become part of this place of a new life not built on titles or assets, but on trust, love, and the extraordinary courage of a child who carried a hope bigger than her childhood. On the morning of the 8th day, everything felt different. Not because all the hardship had disappeared, but because something real had begun. The hospital, once cold and distant in Richard's eyes, now held warmth in every moment. In the way Lily ran down the hallway, clutching her drawing like treasure. In the sound of Rachel calling her daughter's name more clearly each day. In how Richard no longer checked his phone every 10 minutes, but just sat there, listening to Lily's stories with the full attention of a real father. That morning, Rachel sat up on her own for the first time. Her cheeks had a faint flush again, and her eyes were sharper than they'd been all week. Lily beamed as she spooned porridge into her mother's mouth. She told her about the garden, the cocoa, and the new colored markers Richard had bought her. She even told the story of the day she walked into that grand office, hands shaking but heart full of hope. She said she had been scared, but she had also been certain he would listen. Rachel sat in silence, tears falling not from fear or pain, but from something real. She hadn't lost everything. Richard stepped out into the hallway, giving them some privacy. He walked slowly, then stopped in front of a painting on the wall he had never noticed before, a watercolor of a sturdy tree, its leafy branches reaching wide, but its roots stretched underground, touching stone, cracks, and buried things. For the first time in years, he understood the metaphor without even trying. Not everything needs to be perfect in order to live. It just needs space, light, and time. That sentence echoed in Richard Donovan's mind as he stood by the glass window of the hospital room, watching Rachel Thompson sleep peacefully, while Lily sat beside her, drawing with a rare kind of focus. That afternoon, he had a meeting with Rachel's primary doctor and the social worker, Mara. They informed him that Rachel would soon be moved to the recovery ward in the coming days and could begin physical rehabilitation therapy the following week. For the first time, hope wasn't just about survival, it was about renewal. Rachel would walk again. She could return to work. But most importantly, she would live. After the meeting, Richard returned to the room. Lily was sitting under the golden afternoon light, working on a new drawing. This time, it was of a small house, with a shining sun above, and 3 people standing at the door, a woman, a man in a suit, and a ponytailed girl holding both of their hands. He sat beside her and gently asked, "Where is this house?" Lily smiled. "It's our house, when we're all together." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. After a moment, he replied softly, "Then let's make it real." That evening, he began arranging a temporary apartment for the 3 of them in one of his buildings near Longfield Botanical Gardens. Nothing extravagant, just warm, well lit, with space for Lily to draw, read, and live the way a child should. He even ordered a small desk just for her after seeing how she always had to draw on her hospital food tray. As he stood up to leave for the night, Rachel reached out and gently took his hand. "You changed my daughter's and my life," she said, voice weak but clear. Richard looked at her, deeply moved. "You changed me first. Your daughter walked into my office and reminded me who I used to be and what I used to hope for." When he bent down to say goodbye to Lily, she suddenly ran to him and wrapped her arms tightly around his waist. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked. He knelt and hugged her in return, whispering, "I'm not going anywhere." As he stepped out of the hospital, the night breeze swept gently across his coat. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but for the first time, he didn't feel like that was where he needed to return, because he had found home, not a place, but the people who had entered his life from where he least expected. A little girl with a worn-out backpack and 5 simple words, "I need a job. Please." And in the moment he chose to listen, he didn't just save someone, he was saved too. Not by power, but by compassion. Not by big deals, but by the quiet, lasting presence of a child who refused to let go. He had once built an entire world out of numbers, milestones, and objectives. But now he was learning to measure the value of life through time shared, through connection, and through the courage of a child far braver than her years. In a world that often measures worth by wealth, status, and appearances, one little girl reminded us of something deeper, that love is not loud, it's not perfect, it's not reserved for the privileged, it's showing up, it's holding on, it's choosing someone again and again, especially when the world looks the other way. Lily didn't have power, money, or influence. But what she had was enough to move a man who had everything, yet realized he had nothing without compassion. This story is more than just touching, it's a mirror. A reminder that behind every scuffed sneaker, every quiet voice, every weary hospital bed, there is a life that matters just as much as any boardroom decision. So the next time we're tempted to look past someone, ask yourself, what if that child was yours? What if that mother was you? Let's never let love be limited by labels. Let's choose kindness every single time. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. There are more stories, waiting stories of quiet heroes, everyday hope, and the kind of courage this world needs more of. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.